Tonight we begin looking at the Gospel of Luke, and our goal tonight is to look at Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 10. A couple of weeks ago, I introduced the Gospel of Luke, and we find out that Luke's Gospel is the longest of the four Gospels. It's also the longest book in the entire New Testament. And if you put Luke, Acts together, which Luke wrote, both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, those two volumes make up 27% of the New Testament, and Luke wrote more words in the New Testament than any other author. Paul wrote more letters. He wrote 13 letters of the 27 books that are in the New Testament, but in terms of words and pages and volume, it was Luke who writes most of the New Testament. Well, we're going to begin tonight by starting where Luke does, and that is with the prologue. And it's interesting that Luke begins his gospel with a prologue, talking about why he's writing, talking about how he goes about the process of investigating and gathering his sources and actually writing this gospel. It's interesting that Luke identifies who he's writing to, a man by the name of Theophilus, but Luke never identifies himself as the writer. Which is kind of unusual because, again, Paul writes 13 books in the New Testament, and he always begins by identifying himself. Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ. So Luke doesn't do that. Luke doesn't identify himself, but he does tell us a lot about why he is writing his gospel. Basically, what Luke wants to do is establish his credibility. Because we did learn some things about Luke a couple of weeks ago. He was not one of the 12 disciples. He wasn't even a Jewish man. He's a Gentile. And here he is as a Gentile writing about the Jewish Messiah. And somebody may say, Luke, why are you qualified to write about Jesus? You weren't one of his disciples. Yes, you do believe in him now, but you're not even Jewish. So what qualifies you to write a gospel about Jesus? And Luke's going to answer that question. It's interesting that prologues were actually common among ancient writings, including Josephus. And Josephus lived about this same time that Luke did as well. And it's interesting that Luke writes to most excellent Theophilus. And Josephus, in his work called Against Apion, writes to most excellent Epaphroditus. So they use some of the same terminology. And what's also interesting is that most of the writers would write against something. And that's what Josephus did a lot. He was basically defending his credibility to write a Jewish history. Because apparently somebody named Apion called him into question. And so often in this prologue, a writer will say critical things or defend themselves against some opposition. But Luke doesn't do that. Luke is not interested in condemning other sources or other gospels. In fact, he welcomes them, and he also welcomes his own opportunity to write a gospel about Jesus as well. Well, let me read the prologue, which is Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And then we'll talk about what Luke has to say. So here's how Luke begins his gospel. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So that is Luke's prologue. It's the only gospel that actually begins with a prologue like that. So let's talk about what Luke writes. He says, many have undertaken to draw up an account. And Luke lets us know that he's not the first to attempt to write a gospel. He's not the first to write anything about Jesus. In fact, he says many have already done this. And Luke lets us know that when he writes his gospel, he has many sources. In fact, as you look at some of the things that Luke writes about, he probably had more sources than any of the other gospel writers. So some of the other gospel writers were there for Jesus' ministry. Matthew was there. John was there. Mark relied upon what Peter had told him. Luke wasn't there, so Luke's got all of these sources that he relies upon. He doesn't mention any of the sources by name. He doesn't indicate if they were written or oral sources, because basically in the first century, many people didn't know how to read and write. So they would simply pass down their stories by telling them over and over again until you've heard that story so many times you've basically got it memorized. That's one way to pass down tradition. Others did write, and sometimes they would have like a collection of miracle stories that they had come up with, or a collection of Jesus' sayings, or a collection of Jesus' parables that he told. And so all of these collections came to Luke, and eventually he put them together to form his gospel. Most scholars think that Luke, in writing his gospel, had the gospel of Mark in front of him. And he relies upon basically the order of things that Mark lays out. And so that's a good possibility as well. And again, Luke's not saying anything negative about these sources. In fact, he's very thankful that they exist and that he's able to rely upon them. He goes on to say it's an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. When Luke looks at history, it's not just things that happened by chance, by coincidence. It's not haphazard. God has a plan. And the things that took place in Jesus' life happened on purpose. And they were all part of God's plan. And Jesus, when he came, he fulfilled the plan that God had for him. And so Luke wants to point out that what happened to Jesus didn't happen by accident. It was all part of God's plan from the beginning. So in other words, Jesus didn't mess up and actually accidentally get himself crucified. No, the crucifixion, the burial, the resurrection were all part of God's plan before Jesus even showed up. And so Luke wants to point that out in his gospel. He says, these things were fulfilled among us, meaning us Christians. So Luke identifies himself as a believer in Jesus. We're not sure when Luke became a believer in Jesus. Obviously, he did not follow Jesus when Jesus was living on earth and fulfilling his ministry. It was sometime after the ascension that Luke becomes a Christian, but Luke includes himself in the group of believers. And as believers, we want to know everything and everything we could possibly know about Jesus. That's part of what we want to do. And those stories are very important to us. You know, all the information we can gather about Jesus, that's precious information as a follower of Jesus. And so he's gathering this to write up an account, a gospel, talking about Jesus and what he has done. He goes on to say, just as these were handed down to us. And this was the idea of handing down tradition. And again, it's those stories that were told over and over and over again. And they were memorized, basically, and then handed down to people. Now, when we look at the Gospels and we read the Gospels, we read Jesus' stories, like his parables. And they're in the Gospel one time. That doesn't mean that Jesus only told that story once. Chances are Jesus told that story over and over and over again, so that each of those 12 disciples eventually could tell that same story. You know, they're there, and here Jesus is telling this thing for the 50th time. You know, and they're listening and going, okay, I know what he's going to say next. Yep, got that down. You know, I know the story because I've heard it so many times. And back in the ancient world, that's what you did. You told things over and over again so that people would memorize them. And of course, Jesus, in going from town to town, he didn't have to have a new sermon every time he went to a new town. He's got a new audience. So he tells the same stories, the same sermons, the same message over and over again. And these were handed down. And apparently some people began writing them down and then passing them along. They were copied over and over again. Because these were really important pieces of information about the life of Jesus, And believers in Jesus didn't want to lose that. You know, as the disciples were going on, they didn't really know they had to write this stuff down. It was only after Jesus rose from the dead and ascended into heaven that they began thinking, we need to record this. I mean, we need to write this down so that future generations can know about Jesus. And they began collecting all of this information. And Luke says, the ones that I'm relying upon, it came to us from those who were first, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So Luke says, I'm not an eyewitness, but my sources were eyewitnesses. And I went to these eyewitnesses and I interviewed them and I asked them questions and they gave me all of this information. They told me some of the teachings of Jesus. They told me about his miracles and I wrote them down. So I'm not an eyewitness, but my sources were eyewitnesses. And that was very important to establish credibility. Because somebody said, Luke, where'd you get your information? And Luke could say, I got it from eyewitnesses, people who were there with Jesus. I wasn't there, but they were. These were also servants of the word. And the idea of a servant means they were proclaiming the message of Jesus. So the apostles, the disciples, they were telling Jesus stories over and over and over again so that people could hear them and then pass them along to others. So as a proclaimer of Jesus' message, they would want to share his stories, his miracles, his teachings over and over again. And when it says they were servants of the word or the word of God is a technical term in Luke for the gospel message. So these were people who were trying to spread the good news about Jesus. And of course, if they're trying to spread the good news, they're telling his stories over and over again. Also, Luke mentions the fact from the first. It's like, where do you start when you talk about the message of Jesus? And it's interesting that the Gospels start at different places. Luke is the only one who goes all the way back to the birth of John the Baptist. And we're going to begin that story tonight. The other Gospels do not go back that far, although John goes back even further. He goes back to the beginning, like Genesis chapter 1, showing that Jesus was with God, Jesus was God, Jesus was the Creator. And so in his first few verses, he takes Jesus all the way back to the beginning. But historically, in terms of what happened on earth, Luke goes back further than anyone. He goes back to the birth story of John the Baptist. So from an historical perspective, Luke wants to include everything from the beginning, from the first. Verse 3 talks about Luke's credibility. Why should we listen to what he said? What was his method of collecting all this information? He goes, with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything. So Luke says, I investigated. I asked people. And then when I heard a teaching of Jesus, I asked somebody else about that same teaching, just to make sure it matched with what somebody else had told me. So I wanted to make sure that everything I wrote down was accurate and it was true. So in that sense, I investigated and I asked critical questions. I compared my notes from different sources to make sure that what I wrote down was the truth. So, in other words, Luke says, I'm a very careful historian. I did my homework. I did my research. I made sure that what I wrote was true before I sent it to you. So, very important that he did a thorough investigation of everything from the beginning. So he goes all the way back to the beginning, which would have been the ministry of John the Baptist. He says, I too decided to write an orderly account to you. The meaning of the word orderly is, it's kind of general, and you can order something or structure something in a number of ways. You could do it chronologically, And for the most part, Luke's gospel is chronological. I mean, it starts with the birth of John the Baptist. It concludes with resurrection appearances of Jesus. So obviously there's some chronology involved. That doesn't mean that everything in his gospel happened exactly one after the other, but generally there is a given chronology that he follows. Also, you can organize things geographically, and Luke does that. He talks about Jesus' ministry in Galilee, and that entire ministry is one section of his gospel. Then Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem. And there's this journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And during that journey, Jesus does a lot of teaching. And Luke organizes that material in that section. And then finally, Jesus shows up in Jerusalem, basically for Holy Week, the Feast of Passover. And Luke includes that information. So it goes from Galilee to I'm on my way to Jerusalem to I'm in Jerusalem ministering there. So there is a geographical element to Luke's gospel as well. There's also an orderly structure. As you look at how Luke puts his gospel together, there's a lot of order, a lot of structure to what he does. It wasn't haphazard. He just didn't throw in a story here and another story here. He grouped things together in such a way that it made sense. And that was part of what he wanted to do. Which, if you were living back in the first century and you did not have a gospel, you'd hear a story here, a story there, some Jesus sayings, and you'd ask, did Jesus really say that? And then you would hear some other stories about Jesus, but it's not in order. It's not logical. Luke does a great job of making Jesus' life and ministry logical. And that's one of the things that his reader, Theophilus, was looking for. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Theophilus. He's also a Greek, a Gentile. We do know that. There's a good chance that Theophilus is actually paying for this project. He hires Luke to write the gospel. Most believe that Theophilus was already a Christian. He had already been taught some things, but he wanted to know more. And because of that, Luke writes this gospel so that he can learn more about Christ. It's also interesting, he's called Most Excellent Theophilus, which if you were a Roman government official, that's how you would be addressed. And Luke does that in the book of Acts. Most Excellent Felix, Most Excellent Festus. These were Roman governors. And so you would use that terminology, most excellent, in addressing them. Does that mean that Theophilus was a Roman governor as well? Maybe. Or it could just simply be a common courtesy that Luke would call him most excellent. Well, finally in verse 4, Luke's going to tell us why he wrote the gospel. So that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Theophilus has already been taught some things, but he probably has some questions. Maybe he hears a parable that Jesus supposedly spoke, and he may wonder, did Jesus really say that? How can I know for sure that that parable that you're telling me that Jesus supposedly said, that he actually spoke those words? How do I know? Or maybe Jesus' conflict with the religious leaders. And Theophilus may be thinking, Jesus had a conflict with the religious leaders? How did that happen? What was the conflict about? What did Jesus say about that? What did they accuse Jesus of doing? Jesus did miracles? He caused a blind man to be able to see? Really? I've never seen that happen in my life, Theophilus may say. How do I know that's true? Theophilus heard a lot of things. He wants to know for sure that what he's heard is accurate. He needs to make sure people aren't just making up stuff. He wants to know the truth about what Jesus actually said and did. And Luke's going to write this gospel so that that can happen for him. So that when he says that Jesus said such and such, he can have full assurance that Jesus really did say that. Or that Jesus performed this miracle. Or this is what Jesus said to the Pharisees. Or this is what the Pharisees said to Jesus. He needs to know the certainty of what he's been taught. And that's something that we wrestle with too. And here is Luke telling us, I got this from eyewitnesses. I compared my sources. I did my investigation. You can trust what I have written. And so that's very important in the ancient world. It's very important in our world as well. So it's interesting, the idea of being taught. That Greek word is a word from which we get our English word catechism. And basically it was some basic instruction that you would give to people before you baptized them. And it's interesting that the early church did that. They just wouldn't baptize people. They needed to make sure people understood. And so they would teach them about Christ and about who he was, what he did, and why it was so important. And if they believe and receive Christ, they baptize them. Similar to what we do today. I always interview people before I baptize them and ask them, why do you want to be baptized? And looking for their answer. And also to make sure they understand salvation and what baptism is really all about. So they did that back in the first century as well. So maybe Theophilus was one of those who went through one of those classes and learned about Jesus. And then he goes, I want to know more. I need more information. I need a more comprehensive understanding of who Jesus is. So that may have been Theophilus. And as we begin this study, that's my prayer for you as well. That during this study, you'll get to know Jesus even better. Not just coming to a Bible study, but you'll get to know Jesus even better. That you'll hear his sayings in a fresh way. That you will allow his teachings to impact not just your head, but your heart as well. That you'll walk away from this study understanding Jesus better so that you can better know how to follow him. What does Jesus really want me to do? How would Jesus respond to my situation? And based upon what I've learned about him, what conclusion should I make about what I should do in that circumstance? So it's not just informational, it's applicational as well. So that's my goal, that's my hope for all of us. We would get to know Jesus better in this study. Well, that's the prologue. And after the prologue, Luke has some infancy and childhood stories. And it's interesting that these infancy stories, childhood stories, are about both John the Baptist and Jesus. So he's going to talk about the birth of John the Baptist and all the circumstances surrounding John's birth. And he's going to interweave Jesus' birth as well and the circumstances that surrounded Jesus' birth. And he's going to do that because there's a parallel, there's a lot of similarities between John's birth story and Jesus' birth story. Also, Luke wants us to understand that John is the forerunner of the Messiah. He's the one who will go before the Messiah to get the hearts of the people ready to receive the Messiah. So all that God is doing doesn't actually start with Jesus, it starts with John. Because what John does paves the way for Jesus to come onto the scene. And when we read these birth stories, the angel Gabriel shows up in both. I mean, that's a big deal when an angel shows up to talk about somebody's birth. There's also some interesting circumstances around the birth. These are not normal conceptions and births. These are miracle stories. And Luke wants us to understand that. Also, the naming of the child happens in a way that's not customary for the ancient world. There's also some prophecies from the Old Testament that get fulfilled in these birth stories. So you've got what happens to John and what happens to Jesus, and they're very similar. But at the same time, Jesus is superior. His story is even greater than John's story. For example, John's parents, Zachariah and Elizabeth, we're going to find out tonight, are beyond the age of having children. At this point, they should be grandparents, not parents. In fact, you would say Elizabeth's not getting pregnant at this age. But she does. It's a miracle. But then you've got Jesus' birth story and his conception story. And it's Mary, and there's no man involved. She's conceived by the Holy Spirit. That's an even greater miracle. So you got John's story and Jesus' story. They're similar, but Jesus is greater. And Luke interweaves those stories. And let me show you what it looks like. This is chapter 1, verse 5 through the end of chapter 2. He starts with John the Baptist's birth being announced, and then it's Jesus' birth that's being announced. And then the two moms get together. Mary and Elizabeth have a conversation with one another as they meet together. Then there's the birth of John, and then there's not only the birth of Jesus, but some childhood stories about Jesus as well. And as you look at that outline, Luke wrote a very orderly account. There's structure to this. Luke, when he sat down to write this, wrote it on purpose this way. Because he wants to show the parallels between what happened to John and what happened to Jesus. And from a literary standpoint, he brings that out very clearly. So he does a great job of structuring his gospel. What's not shown here is that the first story about Zechariah in chapter 1, beginning in verse 5, takes place at the temple. The last story in this section is 12-year-old Jesus getting left at the temple, then being found at the temple, and at the temple asking questions and answering questions from the leading rabbis. So it begins with a temple story, it ends with a temple story, and that brackets this whole section together. So let's begin with the first story, and that is the birth announcement for John the Baptist. The Old Testament ends with Malachi, and it ends when we say goodbye to the great prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And these great men of God who were prophets used by God as God was trying to speak to the people, and the people just were not listening. Then all of a sudden, the last book is Malachi, and it's about 400 BC. So it would be another 400 years before Jesus shows up. And then there seems to be nothing. God's not speaking. During those 400 years, there's no great prophet. God's not revealing anything to his people. And many scholars call that the silent years. The 400 years of silence between Malachi and the birth of John the Baptist. But once John is born, a new prophet has arrived in Israel. God is speaking again, and he will speak through John the Baptist. And from Luke's perspective, the beginning of the time of the Messiah begins with John the Baptist. So something huge is about to happen. 400 years, God doesn't say a word. Now God's going to do something spectacular, incredible. He's going to send the Messiah. And he's going to send a prophet who's going to pave the way for Messiah to come. So that's the emphasis that we have in the birth of John the Baptist. It's not just the birth of some guy who baptizes people. This is a birth of the man who will pave the way for Messiah to come to Israel. Well, we can subdivide his story into the setting in verses 5 through 7. There's the announcement in verses 8 through 20. The people's amazement at what takes place in verses 21 to 23. And then the promise will be fulfilled in verses 24 and 25. Well, this story goes all the way to verse 25, and we're not going to get that far tonight. But I do want to read verses 5 through 10. And that's the verses we're going to focus on this evening. And it's interesting how Luke begins with his first story. He says, in the time of Herod, king of Judah, there was a priest named Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless, because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Once when Zechariah's division was on duty, and he was serving as a priest before God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. So it's interesting how Luke's going to begin his gospel, and he begins it by showing that what happened to John the Baptist's parents took place in history. In other words, this is not a made-up story. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a fable. This is a real story that happened in history. And it all happens in the days of Herod the Great, called here Herod the King of Judah. Herod reigned over Judah, over the Jewish people, from about 37 to 4 BC. So 37 BC to 4 BC. They call him Herod the Great. We should probably call him Herod the Horrible, because he was a very wicked, vile man. He called himself the King of the Jews, and the Jewish people hated him because he called himself the King of the Jews. You may remember the story of the Magi coming to Jerusalem. After having followed the star, they come to Jerusalem and they ask Herod, "Where is the baby who's been born King of the Jews?" Herod just about had a heart attack when he heard that somebody else would be called the King of the Jews, because in his world, he and only he was the King of the Jews. So Herod tells the Magi to, after talking to the scribes, that this king would be born in Bethlehem, to go to Bethlehem, which was only about 5 miles away, find the child, worship him, then come back and tell me where he is so that I can go and worship him too. Well, Herod was lying. What Herod really meant was, go find the child, and on your way back, come and tell me where he is so I can go and kill him. In fact, at one point, Herod thought that his son wanted the throne, and so Herod killed his own son. That's the type of person he was. And he was the King of the Jews. He was the one who was reigning over the people of Israel in Judea at this time. So that story about killing the babies, because the wise men, they don't go back and tell him anything. They're warned by God to go home. So Herod issues this decree that all the babies in Bethlehem, 2 years of age and under, were to be slaughtered and killed. And that's the type of person Herod was. So it's in the midst of all of that that this story is going to take place. But this is not the story about Herod. This is a story about Zechariah, who happens to be a priest. Now, back in those days, there were many priests in the land of Israel, but there was only one temple. And that meant that the priests were divided into various divisions. And it just so happened that there were 24 divisions of priests. Zechariah belongs to the division of Abijah, which happens to be the 8th division. And each division had about 4 to 9 families who were involved in each division. So these priests did not have to serve every week. In fact, really, they only had to serve 2 weeks out of the year, 1 week at a time, because there's 24 divisions. So you serve, and you don't have to serve again until another 24 weeks. Then you would be up again to serve. Now, it was interesting when Nebuchadnezzar conquered the Israelites in 586 BC, they demolished Solomon's temple. And then Nebuchadnezzar's philosophy was to remove the people from the land of Israel and make them live among other cultures and other people groups so that everybody could become a Babylonian. So the people of Israel had to leave their land, which meant the priests left too. In fact, the priests were out of a job. There was no temple. They had nothing to do, so they left and went and got scattered throughout the Babylonian Empire. Then the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and the Persians said to the people of Israel, you can go back to your land, your country, and start all over again. And so there was this cry among the Jewish people, let's go back and reclaim our country and start our country all over again. Well, the Babylonian Empire was very prosperous. And a lot of these Jewish people who left Israel went to Babylon and other places, and they found jobs. They now have homes. They're making lots of money. It's like, I don't want to leave the good life that I have in Babylon, go back to Israel, which is desolate, and try to start a country all over again. So most of the Jewish people didn't leave, but some did. And they rebuilt the temple, and they got the nation started again. But of the 24 divisions of priests, only 4 came back to the land of Israel. But then they were subdivided again into 24 divisions, and they used the old names that they used to have. So by the time we get to the New Testament, it's this new group that are now serving in the temple. And Zechariah is also married. He's married to Elizabeth, and she's a descendant of Aaron, which means she's the daughter of a priest. A priest was not required to marry the daughter of a priest. But if he could find the daughter of a priest, that would be a special blessing for him. And then in verse 6, there's this incredible description of Zechariah and Elizabeth. I mean, they are described in glowing terms. I mean, they are called righteous and blameless. Not too many people in the Bible get called righteous and blameless. It doesn't mean that they were perfect, doesn't mean they've never sinned, but they were very faithful in following God. When it came to following the law of Moses and doing the right thing in the first century, oh, you would be hard-pressed to find any couple any better than Zechariah and Elizabeth. They were that good. And all of that is a setup for verse 7. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Now, from the book of Ruth, which we just finished, we understand that for a woman in the ancient world, her number one responsibility to her husband was to get pregnant and give birth to a son. And if she could give birth to a son, she would be called blessed, and she would be happy, and she would be fulfilled. Because in ancient times, the inheritance went from the father to the son, usually the oldest son. Then the oldest son needed to get married and have a son as well so that they could pass down the family line. But if you have a couple and the woman can't get pregnant and can't give birth to a son, there's nobody to pass the inheritance down to. So in the minds of the Israelites, the people of Israel, the Jewish people in the first century, if you were a couple and God gave you many children, that meant God was blessing you and God was happy with you. But if you were a couple and you couldn't get pregnant and you couldn't give birth to a son, that meant God was mad at you. He was angry at you, and he was cursing you. Now, what we have now is what we call a situation where my beliefs about God and my reality aren't adding up with one another. Because we just read in verse 6 that this couple was right with God. I mean, they were righteous, they were blameless, and we should be reading in verse 7 that they have many sons, but instead they have no sons. So this belief that the Jewish people have is now being called into question. You know, is it true that if I can't have a son, that God is cursing me? That God is mad at me? That God is angry with me? I mean, it's the story of Job all over again. I mean, Job was righteous in the sight of God, and we know the story. And as Satan said, Job's just, faithful to you because you're being so nice to him. Take away all his blessings and he'll curse you. And there goes Job's family. There goes Job's wealth. And Job's friends come along and say, Job, what'd you do, man? What horrible thing did you do that God is treating you this way? And Job said, I didn't do a thing. And it wasn't adding up. So we have this situation where we think God works in a certain way, and we've got God in this box, and God is supposed to follow, our rules and our understanding of things, and all of a sudden, God isn't cooperating. Because here's a very righteous couple, and they don't have a child. And that doesn't add up in the minds of the Israelites. And in the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, the Jewish world gets turned upside down again and again and again. According to Jewish thinking, if you were rich, that meant God was blessing you, and He was happy with you. But if you were poor, that meant God was mad at you and He was cursing at you. And that world's going to get turned upside down as well. If you were well, if you were healthy, that meant God loved you and pleased with you and He was blessing you with good health. But if you were sick, or if something happened to you physically, where you were crippled, or you couldn't see or couldn't hear, if there was something medically wrong with you, that meant that God was mad at you and God was cursing you. And Luke's going to turn that upside down as well. Many have called Luke the upside down gospel because he takes all of those presuppositions, those beliefs that the Jewish people have, and he challenges them by turning them upside down. Similar to what the book of Ecclesiastes does in many ways. So right from the get-go, first story he tells, we've got a problem. We've got a righteous couple that's childless. And in the Jewish world, that's an oxymoron. But it's a reality that they have to deal with. And just to let you know, Elizabeth and Zechariah, they're both very old. Now, I'm not sure how old very old is. You might know. You can let me know. I don't think I'm there yet. I might be old, but I'm not very old. But it's there to say their situations can't change. I mean, they're beyond the years now of being able to conceive a child. So I'm sure for years and years they prayed and prayed and prayed, God give us a son, God give us a son. They're not even praying anymore for that. They've accepted reality. Elizabeth is way too old to get pregnant. Kind of reminds me of the Abraham-Sarah story. May remind you of that story too. Well, in verse 8, this is part of the announcement. It says, once when Zechariah's division was on duty. And again, Zechariah belongs to the division of Abijah. It's the 8th division, and it's his week. So he's there in Jerusalem at the temple. His division is responsible for the temple. And they're on duty, and they're serving God as a priest. Now, it just so happens that there are more priests than jobs. And so not every priest can do everything. In fact, to decide which priest gets to do what, they would cast lots. They would draw straws, which is what verse 9 says. Zechariah is chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. If you were a priest, the number one highlight of your career, of your life, would be to go into the Holy of Holies and burn incense on that altar. Now, not every priest gets to do this. Every year there's more priests than opportunities, because only one's going to be chosen. And so they drew lots to determine who would be chosen. And once you did it once, you could never do it again. This is just once. This is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And I can just hear Zechariah saying to Elizabeth, I got chosen. You know, they cast lots, and it fell on me. I get to go into the holy place and burn incense before the Lord. This is going to be a moment I'll never forget. This is a story I'm going to tell for the rest of my life. And I'm sure he was absolutely excited. And the priest would go in, and he would have a couple of assistants, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then the assistants would leave. And it would only be him in the holy place, just him and God. in this altar, and he's going to burn incense. And it's a holy moment. It's an incredible moment. And he's going to have an opportunity to do that. So when the time came for the burning of incense, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. So there he is in the holy place by himself, offering up the incense before God. And all the people are outside in the temple courts praying. And he's leading this. So, breaking this down, the fact that Zechariah is chosen by Lot, well, God chose him. God had everything to do with Zechariah being chosen. This wasn't an accident. This was God making sure this happens on purpose. Also, the people out in the temple courts would be praying. And according to Jewish writings, this is what they would pray. May the merciful God enter the holy place and accept with favor the offering of his people. So here's the priest doing his thing, and everybody's outside praying those words over and over again. Well, I want to read to you from my notes what this looks like, and try to imagine it, and then I'll help you imagine it when I get halfway through. Zechariah goes into the temple, and he makes his way toward the golden altar, the altar of incense, which was made out of gold. He is accompanied by two assistants because they've already sacrificed the burnt offering. And one of the assistants will take burning coals from the altar of burnt offering. He'll place it in a golden bowl and bring it into the temple with them. And then when he gets into the temple, he'll spread it out on the altar of incense, all these burning coals. And then that assistant will leave. The other assistant comes in with a golden censer. It's filled with incense. He arranges the incense on the altar, and then he leaves as well. Then there's this moment of silence, because the most solemn act is about to take place. A signal is given. The sacred moment has arrived for Zechariah to place the incense upon the coals, causing a cloud to arise, its fragrance rising and spreading. Now, this incense represents the prayers of the people. And here's the picture, and it's an incredible one. There's old guy Zechariah before the golden altar of incense, and he places the incense on the coals, and it creates this smoke that goes up, and it ascends. And it's a picture of our prayers ascending up into the heavens to the throne of God. So our prayers rise up to God. Incredible picture of what that looks like. And then, together with the ascending aroma, Zechariah would offer a fervent prayer consisting of thanksgiving for blessings received and a petition of peace upon Israel. So as Zechariah is standing there, he's thanking God for all of his blessings upon the people of Israel. Then he prays for the peace of Israel, the peace of Jerusalem. He prays for God to send the Messiah to bring peace and prosperity back to the nation of Israel. That's part of his prayer that he makes. The people gathered outside the sanctuary, but inside the courts, are also praying with outstretched hands. And they wait for Zechariah to return from the altar of incense and proceed eastward to the steps in front of the sanctuary. On these steps, Zechariah, accompanied by other priests, is to pronounce the blessing of Aaron upon the people. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you. And after this blessing, there would be songs of praise. There would be further offerings. And this holy moment would be shared with all the people. What a moment for this priest to be able to walk into the holy place, offer up prayers to God, and to see the smoke arise to God. The lesson for us, our prayers matter. I mean, picture your prayers rising up before the throne of God. And when they get there, God receives them as a fragrant offering. You know, God doesn't say, oh, prayers, away from those, and I don't want those. No, they're a fragrant offering before God, and God receives them. God hears prayers. God answers prayers. And there's power in unified prayer. Not only is Zechariah praying, but all the people are praying with him. This is a holy moment for the people of Israel. And Zechariah, for one day in his life, gets to lead that. Well, the story's not over, and the story's not going to end the way Zechariah thinks it's going to end. He's going to have a visitor who's going to come with an incredible announcement, and we'll pick up there next week. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this incredible story. And Father, what a reminder that our prayers matter, that you want to hear our prayers. You invite us into your throne. And may we remember that picture of our prayers like the smoke just rising up to the throne of God, and you receiving those prayers, loving those prayers, welcoming those prayers, and then answering those prayers. Father, thank you that you're still the God who hears prayers, and you're still the God who can answer our prayers too. So, Father, may we be people of prayer, believing you for whatever you place on our hearts. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.